your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition with Jeanette Roche.
Hello, thanks for joining us for a look back at Alberta this week. With an Alberta election next month, it appears the opposition is in full attack mode. Another United Conservative Party candidate has come under fire for recent comments she made about heart attack victims. During an appearance on the Canadian Story podcast, Chelsea Petrovic, who is the candidate for Livingstone-Macleod and also the mayor of Claresholm, Alberta, said people who have a heart attack should take accountability for their actions. As BCN's Micah Quinn explains, experts say controversial comments UCP candidates are making these days may begin to take their toll on the party.
This might be political suicide here, what I'm about to say.
Chelsea Petrovic, the UCP Livingston-Macleod candidate, mayor of Claresholm, and a nurse of 12 years, was asked a question of how is a lack of accountability manifesting itself in our society by one of the hosts of the Canadian Story podcast.
And I see it in healthcare. Maybe, I'm going to say it. Maybe the reason why you had a heart attack was because you haven't taken care of yourself. You're extremely overweight. You haven't managed your congestive heart failure. You haven't managed your diabetes. And there's no personal accountability.
Petrovic's comments are not sitting right with some, as NDP Lethbridge West candidate Shannon Phillips posted on Twitter that her father passed away from a heart attack. She also said Petrovic doesn't belong anywhere near the provincial government.
The reason why they make these kinds of arguments is because ultimately Danielle Smith's solution is to blame people for their own health conditions, as she has done for cancer, as her own local candidate has done for heart attacks, and so that they can turn around and charge you for that health care.
A new poll has the NDP leading in the battleground of Calgary, with the provincial election set for May 29th. Dwayne Bratt, a political scientist at Mount Royal University, said issues like Petrovic's comments have dogged the UCP.
When you use the phrase, this might be political suicide, that's a good sign that you should stop talking. But she continued.
Bridge City News reached out to Petrovic for comment and to clarify her initial stance on the podcast. She declined an interview, but instead sent us a statement which reads, "The comment was taken out of context. I was speaking for several minutes about the challenges our healthcare system is currently facing, not only as the mayor of Claresholm, but as a frontline nurse. I understand my comment could be offensive when removed from the longer interview, and I should have chosen better language." For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
It appears we may be seeing a serious shortage of workers in the agricultural sector over the next 10 years. According to a recent report by RBC, 40% of farm operators will retire by the year 2033. There will also be a severe shortfall of 24,000 general workers on farms, nurseries, and greenhouses over the same period, and that 66% of them have no successors in place, which puts agriculture on the cusp of the biggest labor and leadership shortage in Canada's history. The director of the Alberta Wheat Commission, Dave Bishop, says it's a huge problem with not a lot of solutions in sight for producers.
There's lots of farms where, maybe none of their children want to farm, or the parents are saying maybe we can't afford to have them farm. So, it's going to be, I would say maybe even less than 10 years, we'll be seeing some changes coming. And I don't know if it's all going to be for the good, because we may have to see larger farms, be more amalgamation of the smaller farms into bigger farms. And I can see more and more of that coming. I think it's just the natural evolution of what's going on in the farm industry right now.
As part of the RBC report, it was suggested that in the short term, permanent immigrant status should be given to 24,000 general farm workers and 30,000 operators to bridge retirement staffing gaps. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba have signed a major agreement to collaborate on economic corridor projects to help boost trade and economic growth for Western Canada. Officials say the memorandum of understanding between the provinces will strengthen the region as a key player in the global market.
Western Canada has long been a robust economic engine in Canada and is an established world leader in many critical economic sectors, with extensive natural resources from agriculture to forestry to energy to petrochemicals to minerals, as well as manufactured goods. Alberta and Manitoba and Saskatchewan have the products that the world needs. and all three provinces rely on strong and efficient economic corridors to get these products to market within Canada and beyond.
We need to take a quick break, but when we return, an exclusive interview with the leader of the federal Conservative Party you won't want to miss. We'll be right back.
I'm going to sue pharmaceutical companies that caused the crisis in the first place. They're the ones that flooded our healthcare system with opioids.
Welcome back. Canadian politics may seem like a disorderly commotion right now. However, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada wants the opportunity to smooth things out, bring balance to our finances, and unite the country. Pierre Poilievre joined Hal Roberts earlier this week to talk about an alternative path forward. Have a look.
Let's talk about Bill C-11 for just a moment here. Now, members within your own party, including Lethbridge MP Rachel Thomas, have expressed major concerns over this bill. She says Ottawa should not regulate what you see, hear, or post online. Now, the federal government says it's simply supporting more Canadian content. How do you see it?
Well, what's Canadian content? You know, the government doesn't decide what's Canadian content. The 39 million Canadians should decide that. You know, it's ironic that Justin Trudeau, of all people, is talking about promoting Canadian identity. He has said Canada has no identity. That is his view. He says we are a post-national country with no distinct identity. And so how could he possibly have a bill that promotes Canadian identity by controlling the internet? It's not about promoting Canadian identity. It's about promoting him and his woke ideology. He wants to put the woke CRTC in charge of manipulating social media algorithms to determine what you see and say on the internet. That's the problem. I don't believe that we should have a tiny clique in Ottawa decide what you see and say. I think your clique should decide what you see and say.
Now, we have a major opioid crime and homeless crisis in many cities across Canada, including right here in Lethbridge in southwestern Alberta. Pierre, let me ask you, what is your solution for addressing these very important issues?
It's common sense. We'll replace the NDP Liberal catch and release for repeat violent offenders with jail, not bail. Those violent offenders who've committed many crimes, who get arrested anew, should be behind bars, not out on early bail or parole. 2, I'll stop giving out taxpayer-funded drugs. So-called safe supply, in theory, was supposed to give addicts drugs that wouldn't kill them. It's done exactly the opposite. They take the government-funded drugs and they sell them to kids. Why? Because they're not powerful enough. And so they sell them to kids, take the profit, and use it to buy fentanyl. That kills the addict. It gets the kids hooked on the hydromorphine provided by the government. The kids find after a while that's not strong enough. So what do? They sell the hydromorphine to another kid who then gets addicted. And then they buy fentanyl and they kill themselves. So my policy is rehabilitation and treatment, not taxpayer-funded drugs. Finally, I'm going to sue pharmaceutical companies that caused the crisis in the first place. They're the ones that flooded our healthcare system with opioids. I'll sue them, and I'll use the money recovered to pay for the treatment and recovery that's required. So to summarize, jail, not bail, for repeat serious violent offenders. 2, stop taxpayer-funded drugs. Instead, go with treatment and rehabilitation. And of course, finally, sue Big Pharma to make them pay for it.
You know, we have a severe doctor shortage across many provinces, including right here in Alberta. The UCP Provincial is doing its part by bringing in more internationally trained physicians and creating a scenario to incentivize more students to get into the healthcare field. What is your solution, Pierre, federally to the healthcare crisis here in our country?
Well, there's 2 common sense solutions. First, I would say that these idiotic vaccine mandates have to go. Believe it or not, there's still hospitals that have vaccine mandates in place that shut out our doctors and nurses and deprive our patients of treatment. Get rid of the vaccine mandates now. They were never justified, but even if you supported them at one point, how is it possible that you can go into a nightclub and kiss a perfect stranger smack on the lips, but you can't go to work without a vaccine? It's obviously not science, it's politics, and it needs to end so we can get our doctors and nurses back. 2, we need to stop discriminating against immigrant and foreign trained doctors. We need 40,000 doctors in Canada. We have 20,000, almost 20,000 immigrant doctors banned from working in their field. Why? Because they were trained abroad. Why not test them and whether they're qualified to meet our standard? This is what I'll do. I'll bring in a national Blue Seal standard for all the professions that involves a test so that an immigrant professional can get an answer within 60 days of applying to work in a profession based on their tested ability, not based on where they come from. And then if they do get licensed, they can work anywhere in Canada, move around the country. We already have a red seal for the trades. Let's bring in a blue seal for the professions.
Watch for more of that interview next week. After the break, we speak one-on-one with the woman behind last year's truck convoy to Ottawa. That's next. Keep it right here. The truck convoy of 2022 and the subsequent Freedom Rally in Ottawa was something both Canada and the world had never seen before. The Freedom Convoy seemed to capture the imaginations and hearts of millions of people. It was also quite controversial, with many who were against it, leading to the federal government invoking the Emergencies Act. One woman became the central figure of the convoy and Freedom Rally. Tamara Leach joined Hal Roberts from her home in Medicine Hat, Alberta, to chat about her experience.
How did it all really begin for you? What led up to the Freedom Convoy?
Well, I think the convoy itself was a collection of a small group of people that had very similar ideas. For myself, I know that I got involved because I was really upset with the mandates and the restrictions. They were affecting my family, my friends, people that I cared about. And about the time the convoy got started, I recall they were starting to discuss interprovincial travel, restricting interprovincial travel. And of course, I've got a large family spread across the prairie. So that was a pretty huge concern of mine to not be able to see my granddaughter.
You know, some of the comments we heard from a lot of our news teams that we sent out to Ottawa during the Freedom Convoy was how many people were kneeling and praying for your group, praying for the entire Freedom Convoy. What feedback did you hear from those around you about all of the prayer that seemed to surround the event?
Well, I've said right from the beginning that I feel that the whole process, the whole experience itself was divine, in that if we needed somebody, they showed up. If we needed somebody with a particular skill set, they showed up. It just happened that everything that happened, there was so many coincidences that they just couldn't be coincidences. And of course, the feedback that we got along the way, traveling across the country and even on the ground in Ottawa, was incredible. Very heartwarming.
Now, you did a lot of work behind the scenes, you and your team. Let's talk about the leadership during that period of time. What was it really like planning leading up to the Freedom Convoy, going all the way across the country, like you said, to Ottawa?
It was busy. I was up early in the morning, usually 5 or 6 in the morning, and going to bed at about 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock at night. We were obviously working on many things like hotel rooms and stops and where we were going to get fuel and what was going to be happening when we got on the ground in Ottawa. So there was a small group of us that were in constant communication. And it was so hectic, but very exciting at the same time. And the great thing about it is that a lot of us that started off as strangers, I didn't know any of these people before the convoy, have now become like family.
Now, looking back, do you feel that there were some saboteurs in your midst? I mean, trying to maybe change the course to distract the core of the leadership group? We've even seen on the mainstream media some of the Nazi flags, Confederate flags. Now, do you feel those were actually plants and not part of your group?
Well, I don't know how they showed up. I know they weren't part of our group. It's quite suspect, especially the Nazi flag, how that just showed up one day. And then, as you saw in the mainstream media, that's all they talked about was a Confederate flag and a Nazi flag, and not the hundreds of thousands of Canadian flags that were out there. So it's fairly suspect that that gentleman with that flag showed up one day and then disappeared, and that's all they talked about. And I guess the other thing that I found after at the inquiry was that they had people like myself and Chris Barber profiled before we even left. So I find it hard to believe that they don't know who that gentleman is.
Now, do you feel that sometimes you had a tough time getting your message across to Canadians through the mainstream media, and that's why you tapped into a lot of independent media, including Bridge City News?
Yes, actually, I don't think the mainstream media got anything right, really. And it really came down to media such as yourselves and other independent media sources and citizen journalists. I think the convoy was really the rise of the citizen journalists because we had all that footage from cell phones.
Now, looking back, Tamara, were there some experiences where maybe you thought, we shouldn't have gone down that road? I mean, we also interviewed a lot of Ottawa business owners who were irate with all of the amount of trucks that were in Ottawa and people trying to get to work. I used to live in Ottawa myself, in Orleans. I used to, work in downtown Ottawa at the Sun News Network. So were there maybe some lessons learned along the way, things you would have done differently, looking back?
Well, that's a whole can of worms, isn't it? I tend to not be kind of a what if person. I believe that everything that happened as it was supposed to happen. There's not too many things I think we could have done differently. To be honest, I'm not sure what we could have changed.
Up next, the battle for Calgary, where the NDP appear to be taking the lead. We'll be right back. A new poll shows the Alberta NDP are ahead of the UCP 47-42 in the battleground city of Calgary. Combined with an investigation into Premier Danielle Smith's alleged ethics violations, could this 5-point lead spell disaster for the United Conservatives in the upcoming provincial election? Naveen Day sat down with our legislative reporter and correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, to get some answers.
Tyler, on a federal level, our Prime Minister has faced a number of ethics violations, and they more or less have washed off his back, minus losing a few seats in the following election. How could this ethics investigation affect Premier Smith's chances of bringing the United Conservative Party to victory?
I think that's a little bit of an open question at the moment. Obviously, what's happened here is you've had sort of a number of different sort of explanations from Premier Smith about what she's actually done, who she's spoken to, that sort of thing. And in the sort of most controversial case, there was a phone call with Pastor Artur Pawlowski, sort of a street preacher in Calgary, who holds, I think it's fair to say, some fairly extreme views. And in this recording, you've Danielle Smith saying that, she's pushing weekly to figure out what she can do for him and that sort of thing. And so I guess what I'm coming around to saying is where the electoral risk for her might be is less the idea of interference and perhaps more who she's interfering on behalf of or who she's alleged to interfere on behalf of. Now, the ethics investigator is going to be looking into this, the ethics commissioner, I should say, but we don't know when, anything is going to happen, right? This information could come in the middle of the campaign, could in theory come once the campaign's finished. But there's no doubt that the NDP is going to try and make this stick as much as possible.
Alberta's NDP justice critic is calling for a full independent investigation on Smith. Calgary MLA Irfan Sabir says an ethics investigation is not enough. Is this the NDP doubling down, or is there significant evidence to suggest that the Premier violated ethics rules?
Well, this is definitely the NDP doubling down. I think they probably see some opportunity here. What you would do beyond an ethics investigation, though, I'm not entirely sure. And I think probably the simplest path forward is to wait and see what the ethics commissioner concludes. If the ethics commissioner concludes that Danielle Smith violated sort of ethics rules, well, what further investigation do you need?
Now, there's some new polling from Janet Brown that shows the NDP is 5 points up on the UCP in Calgary, 47-42. Many political pundits feel that Calgary is going to be the battleground in this upcoming election. But because of the way the seats are distributed in the province, this could actually be a critical lead for the NDP?
A 5% lead is not that big of a lead when you consider sort of margins of error and things like that. But it is substantial in the sense that Calgary is a place that the UCP won by a considerable margin in 2019. It is much more seen as the homeland of the Conservative Party than Edmonton is. So there's some sort of symbolic as well as practical importance to all of this. The NDP is going really hard on Calgary. I believe they're going to be putting their election headquarters in Calgary. They're going to be canvassing very, very hard, big get out the vote effort there because they need to win there. But what it comes down to is how many seats the NDP need to win in Calgary and how many they can win in Calgary. Because if you have all of Edmonton, you've a bunch of seats in Calgary and maybe one or two elsewhere, Lethbridge, for example, that gets them on their way to forming government, but not quite.
Now, the UCP government is also moving to restrict the ability of local police and municipalities to cooperate with federal firearms rules. Essentially, any agreement to participate in something like a buyback must be approved by the Justice Minister. So what sort of showdown could this lead to between the federal government and the province?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's not totally clear to me exactly what the federal government could do in this situation. Could they step in and do this themselves in some fashion? A little bit hard to say. But, it's an interesting situation, not just because of the specific firearms issue, but it's an interesting situation because this is sort of a Sovereignty Act light situation. The government hasn't invoked the Sovereignty Act here, but they are pursuing this strategy that's going to make it a little bit more difficult for the federal government to implement its policy agenda in Alberta. And will it work? I have no idea. But certainly, with an election on the way, firearms owners, by and large, I expect, UCP supporters, there's a little bit of political support to be gathered there, I think. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens. And I don't even think that these buybacks, for example, are planned at the moment. Maybe they are, and I just haven't heard. But, it's not like this is kiboshed, a buyback program this weekend kind of thing.
After the break, a century-old hotel burns down and a man is arrested for arson. Keep it right here. Welcome back. Lethbridge police have charged a 29-year-old man with arson in connection with a fire that destroyed the Lethbridge Hotel. Michael Big Swan of Lethbridge is charged with arson and shop breaking. He was scheduled to make a court appearance on Wednesday. Firefighters responded to the blaze of the century-old hotel on February the 24th. The fire destroyed much of the building and a portion of the front facade was later taken down for the public safety. Following their investigation, officials determined the fire was man-made and suspicious in nature. Police investigators also determined that the fire, which destroyed the Beau Entong restaurant, was suspicious, and a person of interest was identified, but there was not enough evidence to support criminal charges. That investigation continues. Well, this past week saw the 106th anniversary of the Battle of Vimy Ridge. It took place April 9th through 12th, 1917, during the First World War. Over 100,000 Canadians served and fought bravely during the battle. Bridge City News chatted with Lethbridge veteran Glenn Miller about his trip to the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France. He explains why we should always remember the important sacrifices that our veterans made for us. BCN's Micah Quinn has the details.
It's a very powerful monument. It's not a tribute to war, it's a tribute to the sacrifice that Canadians have made.
Glenn Miller told us he first went to France to view the Canadian National Vimy Memorial back in the early 1980s as a student. He's been there multiple times since, and on Sunday, he was back for a special commemoration event with a school group from the Lethbridge Collegiate Institute. Miller said the Vimy Monument has a rich history.
The Mother Canada, who's mourning all of her dead as she looks down over the plain, and on top of the sarcophagus representing a soldier's grave. Very emotional. It's a very powerful monument, even back when it was originally opened up in 1936 by the King. And as part of the war delegation, many of Albertans and other Canadians were part of that initial pilgrimage back in 1936.
According to staff from the Government of Canada, more than 7,000 Canadian soldiers were wounded and 3,600 were killed in the Battle of Vimy Ridge.
April the 9th is Vimy Ridge Day, the anniversary of one of the most significant battles in Canadian military history. That spring morning in 1917, All 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps fought together for the very first time as one formation. And within hours of bravely going over the top of their trenches, they've taken most of Vimy Ridge. By April the 12th, it was entirely in Allied hands, lest we forget.
On top of his trip to the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France, Miller says he's been doing some legwork for the Liberation of the Netherlands Museum, which will recognize Indigenous veterans who have been buried in the country. That event will be taking place on June 21st. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Lethbridge and the greater Alberta area is about to be shown off in a big way. TELUS is launching a new program called #LoveFromTheWest, which will take place from April 11th to May the 12th. It's asking Albertans to showcase scenic areas they call home for a chance at winning cash prizes. Video journalist Micah Quinn talked with TELUS representatives about this fun new initiative.
Our campaign, and the contest in particular, is really the opportunity for Western Canadians to be able to tell us their experience and their love for the West, and be an inclusive story that everyone can tell together.
When you think of some of the nicest natural landscapes in the West, places like Waterton Lakes National Park, Banff National Park, and Writing on Stone Provincial Park might spring to mind. Here in Lethbridge, we have the Nika-Yuko Japanese Garden, the Coulees, and Henderson Lake, just to name a few. Outdoor lovers in Western Canada and Lethbridge are being encouraged to share a photo, video, or written note of their favorite spot on their Facebook or Instagram profile and #LoveFromTheWest and use the TELUS tag.
And the idea is that we can then use that later in a lot of our material, just kind of a shared experience around Western Canadians in general.
Once the contest wraps up, 2 winners, one from BC and one from Alberta, will win $2,500 to give to a local charity, along with an additional $2,500 for a trip to explore any of the beautiful scenery within the 2 provinces.
And in addition to that, they also actually get a Samsung Smart TV.
According to staff from TELUS, since 2000, the company, along with its team members and retirees, have generated more than $1.27 million in cash contributions and volunteered more than 75,000 hours in support of charities and community organizations in Lethbridge. For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Thank you, Micah. Well, families are the bedrock of our society, and sometimes they need a little support. Coming up after the break, we hear from Meryl Kiani, the Executive Director of Lethbridge Family Center. Keep it right here.